First Flush. The train left Oxford at 7:42. Clarissa Hamilton sat by the window, both hands wrapped around a thermos she had brought from home. Earl Grey Darjeeling, loose leaf, black. The only sensible way to begin a November morning. Outside, England slid past like a wet watercolour. The fields lay grey and still, the ground heavy from last week's rain. Isolated trees stood black against the sky, their last leaves long since blown away. A farmstead, a road, a canal whose water was as dark as ink. November in England. There were more beautiful months, that was undeniable. But Clarissa loved it nonetheless. Or perhaps she loved what it did to the world. It stripped away everything unnecessary. No tourists, no summer lightness, no false promises. In November, only the essential remained. She sipped her tea and opened her small black notebook. On the first page she had written her list: postcard teas, Mayfair, Jin Shuan Oolong, Taiwan, autumn, harvest, Gyokuro Asahi, Japan, First Flush, Da Hong Pao, Wuyi Mountains if available, Fortnum and Mason if time, Royal Blend, New Harvest. Ask about the new Darjeeling supplier. She studied the list for a moment, then, in her small, precise handwriting, she added a third entry: Ashford and Sons. Ask Henry whether the Jin Shuan is available there too. Below that, with a more noticeable gap, as though she had hesitated before writing it, Melinda. Tuesday, 7 p.m, Restaurant Marchetti, Bloomsbury. She closed the notebook. Through the window she watched the train pass through a small town, station, car park, a supermarket with lit windows, a woman with a pram, waiting for the barriers to open. Other people's lives, fleeting and complete at once. Clarissa thought of Melinda. She always did, when she travelled to London. Melinda was 25, studying medicine, living with her boyfriend in a small flat in Islington, rarely called, occasionally sent brief messages, matter of fact, correct. Tuesday works. Marchetti is fine, nothing more, but she hadn't cancelled. That was something. Clarissa unscrewed the thermos, poured herself another cup, and leaned back. London was still an hour away. She would use that hour to read an Agatha Christie novel, for the fourth time at least. Paddington Station in November had a quality all its own. Clarissa stood on the platform, her small suitcase beside her, and let the city wash over her. The noise came in layers, the announcements over the tannoy, the rumble of suitcase wheels over stone, the dull echo of the station hall, somewhere the crying of a child, and above it all the smell, exhaust fumes, wet stone, coffee from one of those chain kiosks, and beneath it all, barely perceptible, the promise of rain. She loved and hated that smell in equal measure. London had been her city for 30 years. She knew every square kilometre from Mayfair to Hackney, every underground line. And yet, since she had returned to Rosewood, she felt at every arrival this slight sense of estrangement, as though the city had moved on without her, which of course it had. She took a taxi and gave the driver the name of the hotel. The Savoy would have been too much. She stayed at Fleming's Mayfair, small, discreet, with a breakfast room that smelled of old wood and proper Earl Grey. She always stayed there when she was in London. Some things one did not change. The taxi pulled away. Rain had set in, fine and persistent. It gathered on the windows and distorted the city's lights into long golden streaks. Hyde Park Corner, Green Park, Piccadilly. The trees in the park were bare, their branches black and precise against the white-grey sky. Clarissa watched the city through the misted glass. 5 years, she thought. 5 years she had been living in Rosewood now. It seemed to her as though London had grown louder and more impatient in that time, but perhaps it was she herself who had grown quieter and more patient. The driver turned into the narrow street that led to Fleming's. Postcard teas, she thought, tomorrow morning. And then, almost as an afterthought, Ashford and Sons. I should pop in. Fleming's Mayfair received her with subdued light and the quiet sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the lobby. The receptionist recognized her, or gave every appearance of doing so. In this hotel, that was part of the service. Clarissa appreciated the professionalism without the pretense. Her room was on the second floor. It was small but perfectly proportioned. The window looked onto a quiet courtyard. The curtains were dark green and fell heavily. Against one wall stood a desk of dark wood. Clarissa stepped in and set down her suitcase. The first thing she did was open the small travel bag containing her teas. She had packed 3 tins, a Darjeeling for the morning, a Kashmiri kawa for the evening, and a Lapsang souchong in case a case kept her from sleeping. No case, she told herself. You're here to shop, and for Melinda. She hung up her coat, washed her hands, set the small travel kettle on the desk to boil. Outside, the rain grew heavier. It pattered softly against the window now, steady and relentless. Clarissa stood at the window, hands around a fresh cup of Darjeeling, and looked down into the courtyard. A cat sat motionless beneath an overhang, regarding the rain with the aristocratic indifference of its kind. Clarissa regarded the cat. The cat regarded the rain. The rain fell on, entirely unmoved by either. London in November. Ashford and Sons was situated in a narrow side street, no more than 3 minutes from Savile Row. The sign above the door was of lacquered wood, the lettering in gold. Beneath it, in slightly smaller type, established 1887. The window was dressed with dark green fabric on which individual tea caddies and a porcelain pot had been arranged with a simplicity and precision reminiscent of a Dutch still life. Clarissa paused briefly before it. She had known Ashford and Sons for 22 years. She had shopped here regularly during her London years. She had known old Mr. Ashford, George Ashford, who was said to have died with a cup of Darjeeling in his hand, which Clarissa considered a perfectly dignified way to go. His son Henry ran the shop now with the same precision but with less warmth. The door opened with a soft chime. The smell reached her first. It always did at Ashford and Sons. It was not a single smell but a layering. Wood, tea, something floral, perhaps a white tea, and beneath that something smoky, which came from the Lapsang souchong in the caddies along the right-hand wall. The room was long and narrow, the walls panelled in dark oak. The shelves ran to the ceiling and were filled with tins in burgundy and gold. Along the left side stood a long glass cabinet containing porcelain caddies, British, Chinese, Japanese, each piece bearing a discreet price tag. In the centre of the room stood a long polished wooden table at which one could sit to taste tea. 2 candles burned on the counter. Through the large, misted windows one could see the street outside, the rain, the hurrying umbrellas, the grey November light. It was perfectly quiet, apart from a soft piece of classical music from an invisible speaker. Elgar, if Clarissa was not mistaken. Henry Ashford emerged from the back room. He was in his mid-40s, tall and slender. One could see that he set great store by a well-groomed appearance. He wore a brown jacket, white shirt, but no tie. He recognized her immediately. Mrs. Hamilton. He smiled warmly. It's been quite some time since your last visit. Mr. Ashford, said Clarissa. She extended her hand. You're quite right. The clocks run slower in Rosewood. How are you, and how is the house? Very well, thank you. He smiled. Both myself and the house. I'm very glad to hear it. They spent time discussing the new deliveries. Henry opened tins, let her smell them, spoke of suppliers, of growing conditions, of small shifts in flavour profile. Clarissa asked questions. It was the most pleasant conversation she had had in weeks. Then Henry mentioned, almost in passing, tomorrow evening we have a special event, a private tasting. Sebastian Ford is leading it. Clarissa looked up. Sebastian Ford? You know him? By reputation. Everyone in the London tea world knew the name. Sebastian Ford, tea master, author of 3 standard works on British tea culture, regular guest on radio programmes, known for his inimitable combination of genuine knowledge and complete self-regard. He's the best, said Henry, in a tone that could have meant anything. And you're inviting me? It would be an honour for the house. He lowered his voice slightly. Besides, the other guests are mainly investors. 1 or 2 genuine tea connoisseurs would improve the evening. Clarissa regarded him for a moment. Investors. The way he said the word. It did not sound as though he was pleased about it. It seemed more as though it were a tiresome obligation for which he needed moral support. She would not let him down. She noted the time in her notebook. When? Tomorrow, 7 o'clock in the evening. She was just about to put on her coat when the back door opened. A woman entered. She was in her mid-30s, of medium height and strikingly pale. Her dark, long hair was pinned up in a severe knot. She wore a work apron over a grey, loose-fitting pullover and carried a tea chest under her arm. The chests from Darjeeling have arrived, she said to Henry, but one is still missing, the Makaibari estate. Shall I chase it up tomorrow morning? Yes, please. Henry turned to Clarissa. This is Eleanor Holt, our consultant. She knows every estate in India and Sri Lanka better than I do. Eleanor, may I introduce Mrs. Hamilton? Eleanor turned to Clarissa. Her gaze was direct, her expression friendly. Mrs. Hamilton, I'm delighted to meet you. I've read your books. I'm glad to hear it, said Clarissa. I hope they kept you well entertained. Very much so, replied Eleanor. Do excuse me. Work calls. For a moment it seemed to Clarissa as though the woman swayed slightly as she left the room, despite wearing flat-soled shoes. Eleanor will be there tomorrow evening as well, said Henry, pulling Clarissa from her detail, loving observations. She has put together the tea selection for the tasting. Then I look forward to tomorrow evening, said Clarissa. She put on her coat, said goodbye to Henry, and stepped out onto the street. The rain had intensified. She opened her umbrella. The Marchetti was a small but well-frequented Italian restaurant. It smelled of garlic, oregano, sage and rosemary, and stirred a longing for warm Mediterranean sun, beaches and sea. Clarissa was 5 minutes early. Melinda was there on the dot. Melinda Hamilton was 25, of medium height and slender. She wore a light grey trouser suit, a dark grey long coat and a rosewood-coloured scarf. Her hair was a shade darker brown than her mother's, the cut short, athletic yet elegant. She seemed too cool for the temperamental aromas of this room. The two women embraced briefly. Mum, Melinda. They sat down. A young waitress brought the menus. Clarissa ordered water with lemon. Melinda ordered water without. The waitress's dark eyes regarded them with amusement. When she returned with the drinks, Clarissa had decided on grilled fish, and Melinda on a tuna salad. No antipasti, no dessert, not even coffee. The waitress nodded politely and went to the kitchen, where she loudly and most melodically expressed her opinion. Mamma mia! Ma ci me le manda queste donne inglesi, non sanno apprezzare la buona cucina, ecco perché sono così pallide e magre, che vergogna, Madonna mia. After several minutes of icy silence, Clarissa asked, "How is the degree coming along?" "Well," Melinda broke off a piece of bread, "we're in the clinical phase now. It's a lot. Are you managing?" "Yes." She glanced at her phone, which lay beside her on the table, but no one did her the favour of calling. "I'm glad." Clarissa opened the menu again. A small pause. Melinda took a sip of water. "Why are you in London? Buying tea?" "Among other things." Clarissa gave a brief account of postcard teas of Ashford and Sons, of the tasting the following evening. Talking about tea came easily to her. Melinda listened. Her expression revealed nothing about whether she found the subject interesting. Both seemed relieved to have found a topic that bridged the wait for the food. "Sebastian Ford is leading the tasting," said Clarissa. "The tea man?" Melinda raised an eyebrow. "I once read an interview with him. He sounded rather taken with himself." "That is a precise assessment." The food arrived. They ate in silence. The waitress glanced over at them from time to time and rolled her eyes. When the plates were empty, she came to the table and asked whether they truly wished for neither dessert nor coffee. Both declined in unison and asked for the bill. "How long are you staying?" asked Melinda. "Until Thursday." Melinda stared at her glass as though it were a crystal ball in which she might read something fascinating. Clarissa looked about for the waitress. They sat in silence until the bill arrived. "You're welcome to come," said Clarissa. "Thank you," said Melinda. "Madonna mia," thought the waitress. Clarissa walked back to the hotel. It was just after 9. The rain had stopped, but the street still glistened, and the lights of the shops and restaurants were reflected in the wet paving stones. The air was cold and fresh and smelled of that typical November scent of London, earth, exhaust fumes, something metallic from the Thames wind. She walked through Bloomsbury, past the British Museum, through Covent Garden, where a scattering of tourists still stood with umbrellas and red cheeks outside the restaurants, then southward, towards Mayfair. She thought of Melinda, the silence over dinner, the awkward staring at the phone, the bill, which she had paid without discussion, because that was the only gesture that risked no rejection. In truth, she had expected nothing different. That Melinda had come at all bordered on a miracle. She was still offended. No, she was not offended. Melinda was hurt, disappointed and angry because Clarissa refused to reveal the identity of her father. But the days of heated confrontations were long past. 5 years ago her daughter had moved out. Since then, an ice age had prevailed. She turned into a quieter street. Her footsteps echoed softly on the wet pavement. She had wanted this child. She had had her daughter against the wishes of her partner at the time, and had paid dearly for it. Then she thought of Eleanor Holt. She saw her in her mind's eye, tall, pale, cool, swaying slightly. Or had she only imagined it? The flat shoes did not go with the dress. Such a faux pas would not happen to a woman of such intelligence and elegance. Clarissa's thoughts drifted back to Melinda. The moment she had known she was pregnant, she had stopped smoking, stopped drinking, and banished every pair of high-heeled shoes. The flat shoes, the pallor, the slight swaying. The circle had closed. Clarissa continued on her way. Outside the hotel, she paused for a moment on the pavement and looked up at the night sky. No stars, too many clouds, too much city light. But the moon was somewhere behind them. One could sense it. Ashford and Sons had transformed itself for the evening. The candles on the long tasting table were lit. The tea caddies on the shelves shimmered in burgundy and gold. On the table stood white porcelain, pots, cups, small bowls for the tea leaves, everything arranged with a precision that recalled the setting of an altar. In a few moments, a sacred ritual would be celebrated here. Outside, London lay in November darkness. The rain had set in again, and against the tall shop windows the fog pressed like a curious guest. One could barely make out the street, only halos of light around the lanterns, blurred outlines, occasionally an umbrella passing by. Inside it was warm. It smelled of beeswax and tea, several varieties layered one upon another. Added to this was the scent of freshly baked financiers. The expensive perfumes of the guests completed the potpourri. Clarissa entered and let her gaze sweep once around the room. 8 guests had come. Along with Henry Ashford, 2 young assistants in black aprons, and Eleanor Holt, who stood at a side table arranging the tea caddies for the evening in an order that Clarissa immediately recognized as considered: light teas first, then fuller-bodied ones, and the smoky varieties as a fitting conclusion. Eleanor wore a dark green dress and flat shoes. Her long hair fell open over her shoulders. With this style it suited her far better, making her look noticeably younger and softer. Clarissa found it became her. She caught herself taking a liking to the woman. Eleanor had also applied makeup, discreet, but clearly visible. The pallor was well concealed beneath powder and rouge. Before the tasting began, Eleanor and the assistants had laid the tables. On each tray lay several financiers on white porcelain, beside them a folded napkin. The assistants had brought the teapots. The trays Eleanor had prepared herself. Clarissa noted it and looked on. Henry Ashford came towards her and introduced her to the other guests. There was Marcus Hale, mid-50s, broad-shouldered, firm handshake. Businessman, investments, property, various interests. He wore an expensive watch and glanced at it too often. One could see that he would rather have been elsewhere. Dr. Patricia Lowell, art historian, thin and attentive. She knew Clarissa's books and said so with genuine enthusiasm. Gerald Finch, solicitor, salt and pepper hair, impeccable suit, a glass of water in his hand. And 3 others, tea collectors, dealers, an elderly gentleman with a walking stick who introduced himself as a former diplomat and said he had drunk the finest tea in the world in Taiwan in 1987 on a plantation whose name he had unfortunately forgotten. Clarissa nodded, smiled, made small talk and gathered information. Hale, she thought. Investors. The word Henry had used yesterday in that peculiar tone. Sebastian Ford arrived exactly 5 minutes late. It was no accident. Clarissa saw that immediately. He appeared in the doorway and held his position until every eye in the room was upon him. Only then did he enter. Sebastian Ford was in his early 50s, tall and well-built. His grey hair was carefully groomed. He wore a dark jacket over a wine-red pullover. The watch on his wrist was expensive without being ostentatious. He greeted the guests. A handshake for the gentlemen, a brushed kiss on the cheek for the ladies. Clarissa endured the familiarity with a stoic expression. Clarissa Hamilton, I've read The Thornfield Affair. Excellently constructed. Thank you, said Clarissa, and I have read your third volume on East Asian tea culture. Most informative. A barely perceptible hesitation. The way she said informative was no compliment, but he did not notice. He smiled more broadly and turned to the next guest. Clarissa took her seat. She observed that he passed Eleanor over entirely. No glance, no nod. Eleanor stood at the side table. She did not look towards him either. Their eyes did not meet once. They ignored one another with admirable consistency. It could not be coincidence. Clarissa sipped her water thoughtfully. The tasting began with a Japanese gyokuro. The intense flavour reminded Clarissa of a bowl of miso soup. The rich, thick mouthfeel of the miso paste, the savoury taste of tofu and mushrooms, a hint of salt and that maritime or vegetal quality of the seaweed. Sebastian explained the cultivation, harvest and brewing temperature with a precision that impressed, and a self-assurance that mildly exhausted. Everyone fell silent, impressed. Clarissa drank, listened, and observed. The second tea was a Taiwanese high mountain oolong, floral, complex, with a warmth that lingered in the throat. Dr. Lowell asked a perceptive question about the oxidation levels. Sebastian answered at length. Marcus Hale drank his tea with an expressionless face. He asked no questions about the tea. He asked questions about the house, about the turnover, about the supplier contracts. Henry Ashford answered politely and evasively. Clarissa noted the tension that lay clearly between the two men. Then came the lapsang souchong. Eleanor carried the pot to the table, a dark red Yixing clay pot. The smell filled the room immediately, smoky, resinous, intense, like a campfire carried in the memory. "This tea," said Sebastian, "is the most honest tea there is. It does not hide. It is what it is." Clarissa lifted her cup. The lapsang was dark, golden, almost amber. She inhaled it, let the spiced steam rise, and took a sip. Sebastian drank as well. Then he reached for a financier on his tray and ate it, without taking his eyes from his audience. He continued speaking. He drained his cup. Clarissa ate her own financier. Almonds, butter, a hint of brown sugar. A pleasure. 47 minutes after the tasting had begun, she checked her watch later and counted back. Sebastian Ford stopped speaking in mid-sentence, abruptly, like a device from which the power has been cut. He blinked, once, twice. He passed a hand across his forehead, his mouth opened, closed again. Then he said something that made no sense, a string of words that did not belong together. Dr. Lowell leaned slightly forward. "Are you quite all right?" Sebastian's eyes had a changed expression, wide, unfocused, the pupils conspicuously large even in the warm candlelight. He was looking at someone who was not in the room. His lips were dry. On his cheeks and forehead lay a marked flush that did not come from the warmth of the room. He stood up, too quickly. The chair fell back. "Sebastian!" Henry Ashford was immediately on his feet, took out his phone and dialed the emergency services. Sebastian Ford leaned heavily against the tasting table, unable to form a coherent sentence, his hands trembling, his face flushed. He tried to speak and produced only fragments. Clarissa observed the scene carefully, the pupils, the flush, the confusion that was not intoxication, the dry lips. She did not know this combination from personal experience, but she had read enough, researched enough for her books, to know that these symptoms matched neither a heart attack nor a stroke. While Henry was on the phone and the other guests stood in small, agitated groups, Clarissa quietly stepped back to the table. She opened her handbag and took out 2 small vials. She had carried them for years, for samples of all kinds, as a precaution. With a spoon, she unobtrusively scraped the crumbs from Sebastian's tray into the first vial. Then she filled the second with a little lapsang from the yixing pot. She sealed both and slipped them into her handbag. Nobody was watching. The others were too preoccupied with Sebastian. They helped him into an adjoining room and laid him on a sofa. Everyone gathered around him, some out of curiosity, others out of concern. They waited impatiently for the paramedics. Clarissa returned to the tasting room where Eleanor was silently clearing the table. The tasting was over. Clarissa stood at the edge of the room and watched as they lifted Sebastian Ford onto a stretcher. He was conscious. His eyes followed the movements around him, but with a kind of blurred astonishment, as though he were observing a world that differed slightly from his own. He murmured something. One of the paramedics bent towards him, nodded, noted something on a clipboard. The guests stood in the doorway between the adjoining room and the tasting room. Marcus Hale had his phone in his hand, but was not making a call. He was simply staring at it as though uncertain whom to ring. The former diplomat leaned on his stick and looked as though he had witnessed far more dramatic scenes in his life. Dr. Lowell had taken the younger of the 2 assistants by the arm. The girl had gone very pale. Gerald Finch stood upright and silent, hands clasped behind his back. Henry Ashford followed the stretcher to the door. He returned shortly after. Clarissa went to him. "Henry, do you have someone to take you home this evening?" He looked at her, almost surprised by the question. No, I'll drive myself." "Please don't." She said it quietly, without emphasis. "Call a taxi." He nodded mechanically. The paramedics maneuvered the stretcher through the narrow door. Through the misted shop window one could see the blue flashing light of the ambulance reflected on the wet street, a steady, cold pulsing that split the November night at short intervals. Then the vehicle was gone. Clarissa returned to the tasting room. Eleanor stood at the side table, packing the tea caddies into her transport box. Her movements were calm, precise, controlled. She picked up a caddy, checked the label, placed it in the box, then the next. "Miss Holt." Eleanor turned around. "Mrs. Hamilton, what a dreadful evening." "Yes," said Clarissa, "it is." She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back. Between them lay the long oak table with the white porcelain, the candles still burning, and the faint smell of lapsang souchong that lingered in the warm room like a memory. "Do you have any idea what might have happened to him?" asked Clarissa. Eleanor shook her head. "The doctors will find out. Perhaps he was feeling unwell and didn't say so." A brief pause. "He is not the type to admit weakness." "No," said Clarissa, "he is not." She observed Eleanor for a moment longer, then she smiled slightly. "Don't let the evening weigh on you too heavily. You did excellent work." Eleanor smiled back. "Thank you." Clarissa put on her coat and said goodbye to the remaining guests. Henry Ashford stood in the doorway and looked as though he had aged 10 years. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, Mrs. Hamilton." He paused. "Do you think he will?" "Let us hope he recovers," said Clarissa, and stepped out onto the street. The gas lamps outside Ashford and Sons burned through the fog, their light soft and indistinct like watercolour running on wet paper. The narrow street was completely empty. The blue flashing light had long since gone. Somewhere in the distance a bus passed. Its light swept across the wet street and disappeared. Clarissa had not yet reached the corner of the street when the door of Ashford and Sons opened again behind her. "Mrs. Hamilton." She turned around. Henry Ashford stood in the doorway, phone in hand. "The police are coming. They rang from the hospital. The doctors suspect poisoning. The police would like everyone to remain." Clarissa turned back. The Metropolitan Police arrived 30 minutes later. 2 uniformed constables first, then a woman in plain clothes. Detective Inspector Marsh was in her late 40s, of medium height, with short grey hair and a businesslike manner. She wore a dark trouser suit and trainers that did not quite go with it. She held a notebook in her hand. "I would ask everyone to remain on the premises for the time being," said Marsh. The constables secured the entrance and the back exit. A forensics team arrived shortly after. Sebastian's place was secured. The plate, the cup, the tray, the tea caddies in the immediate vicinity. One of the technicians photographed the room systematically, without fuss. Another knelt beside the oak table and examined the surface with a small magnifying glass. Clarissa stood at the edge of the room and watched. Then her gaze fell on Sebastian's tray. It was still where it had been, but the plate with the financier crumbs was gone. Detective Marsh took the guests one by one, brief, precise interviews at one of the smaller tables while the forensics team continued working through the room. When she came to Clarissa, she sat down opposite her, opened her notebook, and looked at her. "Mrs. Hamilton," she glanced at her notes, "crime writer. Yes. And you were here this evening as a guest. Henry Ashford invited me. I'm a long-standing customer of the house." Marsh made a note. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Clarissa let a moment pass, not from hesitation, but because she wanted to consider carefully how much she said and in what order. The atmosphere was somewhat tense, but that was not unusual for such occasions. There were some discussions about the pricing of the teas. A few guests seemed dissatisfied. D.I. Marsh nodded and noted something quickly. "And Sebastian Ford, how was his behaviour?" "He was normal." Clarissa chose her words carefully. "He seemed engaged, spoke a great deal about his latest discoveries, and I had not noticed that he felt unwell. I did not speak with him directly, but he was absorbed in conversation." "Did you have particularly close contact with him during the evening?" "Not directly. We had only spoken briefly about tea, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until the incident, there were no signs at all that anything was wrong." Marsh looked at Clarissa, and it was plain that she was interested in the answer. "Did you observe anything else?" Clarissa hesitated briefly. Then she said, "No." D.I. Marsh closed her notebook. That night, Clarissa slept badly. That was unusual for her. Normally her mind worked even in sleep, sorting, ordering, setting aside. But that night the thoughts circled without order. Sebastian's dilated pupils in the candlelight, Eleanor's hands calmly packing the tea caddies into the box, the small vial in her handbag, and Melinda's face at dinner, the staring at the phone that did not ring. At 5:30 she got up. She prepared the Darjeeling carefully with the small travel kettle and the tea strainer she always brought with her. She stood at the window. The courtyard still lay in darkness, only a single lamp burning above the back entrance of the neighbouring building. The rain had stopped, but the paving stones still glistened, and water stood in the gutters. She drank her tea and thought. Her instinct told her that the poison had been in the pastry and not in the lapsang, but she had no proof, not yet. She drank a last sip of tea, set down the cup and reached for the phone. James Whitmore answered on the second ring. "Clarissa." His voice sounded sleepy. "It's 6:30. "I know. Good morning." He sighed. "What's happened?" She liked that about James. He asked no superfluous questions. She had met him 12 years ago at a Sotheby's auction. Both had wanted the same tin of a 1972 Chinese pure. James had won. She had never quite forgiven him. In return, they had become friends. "I was at Ashford and Sons last night at the tasting. With Sebastian Ford." He sounded more awake now. "I read about it this morning, online. Tea Master collapses at event. Very dramatically phrased. It was, and you were there. It was not a question." "Yes." Clarissa sat down at the desk. "James, I need information about the investor group, the people who want to buy Ashford and Sons. How long has this been going on?" From the sounds of it, he pushed back the covers and got up. A dull thud told her he had dropped the phone in the process, and muffled, indistinct cursing confirmed the suspicion. "Are you still there?" he asked, and continued without waiting for an answer. "For a good 2 years, perhaps longer. The man behind it is Marcus Hale. Do you know him?" "I met him last night." "Then you'll have formed an impression." James's voice took on a slightly dry tone. "Hale is not exactly a tea lover. He's someone who buys things that have character and then turns them into things that make money. He did it with 2 hotels in Edinburgh, with an old bookshop in Bath, and with a vineyard in Kent. The result was always the same: smarter, larger, more profitable, and utterly soulless. And Ashford and Sons? He wants to turn it into a chain. He has his eye on 3 outlets in London, 2 in Edinburgh, and 1 in Manchester. Modern concept, broad range, higher turnover." A pause. "Sebastian Ford considers him a Philistine, and makes no secret of it in public. Does Hale have connections to anyone with a chemical or pharmaceutical background?" A brief silence. "That is a very specific question, Clarissa." "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "One of his investors," he said at last, "a man named Gerald Ashby, no relation to the tea house, just an unfortunate coincidence of names. He worked in the pharmaceutical industry. Not as a scientist, as a manager, sales, that sort of thing. But he has contacts in the field. That is well known." Clarissa wrote the name in her notebook. "Gerald Ashby, farmer, Hale investor. Can you get me Hale's office address?" "Probably. What for?" "I'd like to pay him a visit." A very long pause. "Clarissa," said James at last, "are you planning to do the police's job for them again?" "Perhaps," she said. "Perhaps I'll write about it in my next novel. Thank you, James." She attended to her shopping first. Postcard Teas in Mayfair opened at 9. She was there at 5 past. The shop was as she remembered it, small, perfect, and without compromise of any kind. No mass-market goods, no decoration for decoration's sake. Every tea had a story, and the staff knew them. A young man with glasses and a checked shirt greeted her with the quiet enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loves his work. She spent 50 minutes there. She bought the Jin Shuan Oolong, Taiwan autumn harvest, with a floral aroma reminiscent of gardenias and a slight creaminess on the finish that was entirely natural and not, as some dealers claimed, produced by added flavourings. She bought a Himalayan second flush, a Darjeeling from a small estate near Kuseong, of which only 30 kilograms were exported per year. And she had a sample of a white tea from Yunnan packed for her, one she did not yet know, and about which the young man with the glasses spoke with a contagious enthusiasm. As she paid, she thought of Marcus Hale and of Gerald Ashby, farmer, Hale investor. She took her bags, thanked the young man, and stepped out onto the street. The morning was cold and misty. The plane trees on the other side of the street stood bare and black, like ghosts raising their arms. She took out her phone and sent James a message. The reply came 3 minutes later. An address in Mayfair, no more than 10 minutes on foot. The office building was from the early 20th century, with a facade of white Portland stone that had been restored and, in the process, had lost something of its original irregularity. Everything about the building was correct and faintly sterile. Clarissa entered and gave the receptionist her name. She had not announced herself. She wanted to catch Hale off guard. She waited 4 minutes, long enough to show that he was busy, short enough to show that he was willing to receive her. Then she was shown to the 4th floor. Hale's office was large, with a window looking onto a planted courtyard. Dark furniture, little that was personal, no photograph, no disorder. A room that radiated control and revealed nothing. Hale stood as she entered. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps he simply seemed taller in his own surroundings. "Mrs. Hamilton?" He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Clarissa sat down and came straight to the point. "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Hale. I am a crime writer. I research, among other things, for a new novel, and last night's events have, shall we say, inspired me." Hale grinned and leaned back. He folded his hands on the desk, a gesture that simulated openness. "And what can I do for you? Can you tell me something about the relationship between yourself and Sebastian Ford?" His grin widened. It was plain that he considered Clarissa an amusing diversion, but by no means a threat. "We have differing views on the development of the tea trade. That is a very courteous way of putting it. I am a courteous man." He regarded her. "What do you really want to know? Whether you were angry with him?" "Angry? You think I poisoned him?" He laughed briefly. He seemed genuinely amused. "Mrs. Hamilton, if I wanted to harm someone who was obstructing my business, I would do so through lawyers, through contracts, through market pressure, not through poison. How is the poor fellow anyway? Is he still alive?" "I have no idea. As I am not a relative, The hospital will give me no information. Do you have an investor named Gerald Ashby? Hale cleared his throat. The conversation was beginning to bore him. His grin had gone. Ashby is one of several backers. Yes. He regarded her more attentively now. You've done your homework. I always research. Clarissa held his gaze. Does Ashby have pharmaceutical connections? He worked in the industry 10 years ago. Hale's tone was now somewhat strained. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hale. Clarissa stood up. Hale stood as well. I had nothing to do with what happened last night. I told the police the same thing, though their questioning was not quite as rigorous as yours. The grin was back. I believe you. Clarissa's expression did not change. He took her coat and helped her into it. Every inch the gentleman. Clarissa sat down in a cafe 2 streets away. She ordered tea. The best they could offer was a mediocre Assam in a white ceramic mug. She opened her notebook and jotted down in bullet points what she had just learned. Then she paused. Hale was a man who would dispose of a potential adversary differently. A poisoning at a public event did not fit this man. It was too emotional. She tapped her pen on the paper. What had happened last night had something deeply emotional about it. This was personal. She looked out through the misted window onto the street. November London passed by. A man with an umbrella that the wind had half turned inside out, against which he was fighting without success. 2 women with shopping bags bending over something one of them was showing on her phone. A bicycle courier waiting at the red light, rubbing his hands. Clarissa took a sip of the mediocre Assam and thought of Eleanor. That quiet, pale woman with the flat shoes. She recalled the slight swaying as she left the room. She thought of Sebastian's gaze, which passed by Eleanor, not through her, but deliberately past her. Clarissa closed her notebook. She stood up, left money on the table, and stepped out onto the street. She urgently needed to speak with Peter Voss. Peter's pharmacy was situated in a quiet side street in Bloomsbury, no more than 10 minutes from the British Museum. Clarissa had known the way for 20 years. She knew the street, the slight curve before the corner house, the narrow passage between 2 buildings through which one could save a minute when coming from the direction of Russell Square. She knew the smell of the small bakery 2 doors along, which even in November held the promise of fresh bread. And she knew the plain sign above the pharmacy door, P. Voss, Pharmacy, in discreet blue lettering. She pushed open the door. A bell chimed softly. The pharmacy was long and narrow, with white shelves on both sides and a counter of pale wood at the far end. Everything was clean and orderly. A young man behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to see Mr. Voss, please. He's expecting me." The young man nodded and disappeared through a door at the back. Clarissa waited. She studied the shelves, the neat rows of preparations, the handwritten labels on some of the older drawers, a small picture on the wall. Then Peter Voss emerged from the back room. He was in his early 60s, of medium height, with the slightly rounded build of a man who had never taken exercise and had no intention of starting. His hair was grey and neatly parted. He wore a white coat over a blue shirt, and from a thin cord around his neck hung a pair of reading glasses. His face lit up when he saw her. "Clarissa." He extended his hand. "What a pleasant surprise. I thought you were in Rosewood." I've been in London since Tuesday. She shook his hand. I need your help, Peter. He looked at her briefly. Then he held open the door to the back room. Come in. The back room was Peter's real world. It was spacious. A long workbench of white laboratory material stood in the centre. Along the walls were shelves of reference books, technical works, and labelled containers. In one corner stood a small desk with a computer. From the look of the screen, he was in the middle of placing an order. On the workbench lay neatly arranged papers, a microscope, a row of pipettes, and a small device that Clarissa could not immediately identify. Peter drew up a second chair. They sat down. Tell me, Clarissa reported, factually, chronologically, without embellishment, the tasting, Sebastian Ford's symptoms, her observations. Peter listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, And the samples? Clarissa opened her handbag and placed the two small vials on the table. The first contains crumbs from Sebastian's tray, from his pastry. The second contains tea from the pot from which his lapsang souchong was poured. She folded her hands in her lap. I am wondering whether there is poison in them. Peter picked up the vials. He held them to the light, turned them slowly, examined the contents. How did you secure them? During the confusion after the collapse. Nobody noticed. He set the vials carefully back on the table. What you have brought me, said Peter, are not controlled laboratory samples, no secured chain of evidence, no sterile collection. That limits what I can do and what the results can prove. I know. Good. He tapped a finger on the first vial. The pastry crumbs. If a poison such as atropine is present, and you have given me good reason to suspect it, I could establish that with a relatively simple screening test, a thin-layer chromatography test, or an immunological rapid test for alkaloids. He paused briefly. I have the means to do that here. It would be 2 to 3 hours' work. And the result would be reliable? It would be an indication, a strong indication, but not admissible as evidence in court. For that, documented sample collection under controlled conditions would be required. He looked at her directly. What I can give you is a statement this sample does or does not contain an atropine-like substance. Nothing more. That is perfectly sufficient. He nodded. The second vial, the lapsang souchong. He picked it up, briefly smelled it without opening it. Lapsang is an intense, smoky tea. It naturally contains phenolic compounds that can interfere with a simple screening. That makes the analysis more difficult and more prone to error. He set it down. I would recommend analyzing the tea sample second and interpreting the results with caution. Understood. Clarissa looked at the vials. How long in total? Peter leaned back and calculated briefly. For a first, reliable statement on the pastry sample, 3 hours, perhaps 3.5. For the tea sample afterwards, another 2 hours, but as I said, with limitations. He looked at his watch. If I begin now, I would have results for you by evening, around 6, past. I would be very grateful. I know. He stood and took the vials. Then he turned once more. Clarissa, have you told the police about these samples? Not yet. Peter prepared his workbench, arranged the materials, labelled 2 small sample vessels with the date and a number, made a brief handwritten note on a clipboard. Clarissa remained seated and watched him. It was a privilege he granted to few, to sit in the back room while he worked. Clarissa knew that. "Tell me about the tea-house," said Peter, while he worked. "Ashford and Sons, you say?" "Yes, do you know it?" "By reputation. I went there once many years ago." He opened a drawer and took out a small bottle of clear liquid. "A very fine establishment. Old Mr. Ashford was a connoisseur. His son runs it now. And he has a consultant." Peter pipetted carefully. "Eleanor Holt, you said?" Clarissa looked up. Something in Peter's tone was casual, too casual. "Yes," she said. "Eleanor Holt. Do you know her?" "No," he said. Outside the window of the back room it looked onto a narrow light well. Light rain was falling. He turned back to the workbench. "I'll ring you at 6, he said. "All right." She stood up. He did not accompany her to the door. There was no need. She knew the way. At the door of the back room she paused briefly. "Peter." He looked up. "Thank you." Clarissa stepped out of the pharmacy onto the street. The rain had grown stronger in the meantime, not heavy, but determined. She opened her umbrella and paused for a moment. She had, until 6 o'clock in the evening, 5 hours. She took out her phone and sent Melinda a message. "Do you have time this afternoon? I'd like to come by." The reply came after 2 minutes, from 3. "Just ring the bell." Clarissa put her phone away and walked through the November rain in the direction of Russell Square. Melinda's flat was on the 3rd floor of a Victorian terraced house in Islington, in a quiet street with plane trees whose bare branches reached over the cobblestones. Clarissa rang the bell at 3:15. The rain had stopped, but the street was still wet. Melinda opened the door after the second ring. She wore jeans and a loose grey pullover, her hair tied back loosely. She looked her mother in the face. "Come in." The flat was small and very tidy. Books on a shelf, medical textbooks stacked on the desk, a dried bunch of lavender on the window sill. "Coffee?" asked Melinda, already on her way to the small kitchen. "If you have tea." "I have a tea bag somewhere." Melinda opened a cupboard. "Earl Grey from the supermarket." "That is perfectly all right," said Clarissa. Melinda glanced over her shoulder. "Really?" "Really." They sat down at the small kitchen table. They talked about her studies and the general matters of daily life. The atmosphere was not warm, but none the less more relaxed than dinner at the Marchetti. Then, casually, as though it had just occurred to her, "You're in the clinical phase now. Have you done toxicology yet?" Melinda looked up. "Yes. Why?" "I'm doing some research." Clarissa wrapped her hands around her cup. "Anticholinergic poisoning. Atropine specifically. How quickly does it act when taken orally?" Melinda leaned back slightly. "Depends on the dose and the medium. Absorption is slower through fatty food. I would estimate 40 to 60 minutes until the onset of symptoms." "And the symptoms themselves?" "Classically anticholinergic." Melinda listed them. "Mydriasis, that is, dilated pupils. Tachycardia, dry mucous membranes, dry skin, flushing of the skin because the sweat glands fail and temperature regulation is disrupted. At higher doses, then, central nervous system effects, confusion, disorientation, hallucinations, agitation." She took a sip of coffee. "In layman's terms, blind as a bat, red as a lobster, dry as a bone, hot as a hare, mad as a hatter. That is memorable. It's meant to be. A mnemonic." Melinda set down her cup. Then, without looking up, "What dose would be non-lethal but publicly conspicuous?" Clarissa said nothing. Melinda looked up. "Mum." Her voice had lost its professional tone. "What has happened?" Clarissa told her. The tasting, Sebastian Ford's collapse, the symptoms she had observed. When Clarissa had finished, Melinda was silent for a moment. "The dosage," she said at last. "You say he survived and was conscious." "Yes." "Then the dose must have been precisely chosen." She looked at her hands. "That requires expertise." "Yes." "And you think you know who it was?" "I have a feeling." Melinda looked at her. "Have you told the police?" "I'm waiting for confirmation." "From whom?" Clarissa hesitated for a moment. "From an old acquaintance. He is currently examining 2 samples I secured." Melinda regarded her mother with a long, calm look. It was a look Clarissa knew. It said, "I am asking no further questions because I do not want to hear the answers, and at the same time, I am worried." "And the person who did it," said Melinda at last. "Why? What was the motive?" Clarissa set down her cup. "I don't know yet," she said. "I haven't spoken to her yet." Silence. Melinda looked towards the window. The plane trees outside moved slightly in the wind. "And when will you speak to her?" asked Melinda. "Tomorrow." At 6:03, Clarissa's phone rang. They were still sitting at the kitchen table. Melinda had made fresh coffee and set another cup of bag tea in front of Clarissa. The conversation had moved in other directions. A film Melinda had recently seen, an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum running until December. Clarissa looked at the display. Peter Voss. "Excuse me for a moment." She stood up and went to the window. "Hello, Peter." "Hello, Clarissa." His voice was calm. "I have analyzed the first sample, the pastry crumbs." "And?" A very brief pause. "Atropine, unambiguously detectable. The concentration is difficult to quantify from this sample size, but the substance is beyond doubt present. The thin layer chromatography shows a clear, characteristic pattern. I ran the test twice. The result is the same." Clarissa looked out at the street below the window, the plane trees, the wet pavement, a woman with a child by the hand walking through the puddles. And the tea sample? Negative, no traces of atropine in the lapsang. A pause. The poison was in the pastry, not in the tea. "Yes," said Clarissa, "that is what I suspected." "And what will you do now?" "I will speak to Eleanor tomorrow. Thank you, Peter." She hung up. Clarissa stood at the window for a moment longer. Then she turned around. Melinda stood in the kitchen doorway. "Well?" she asked. "The crumbs contained atropine unambiguously," said Clarissa, "and that means I shall be paying Eleanor an unannounced visit tomorrow morning." "Take care of yourself, Mum." Clarissa nodded. "And then you're going back to Rosewood?" "Yes, Thursday as planned." Melinda leaned in the doorway, arms loosely folded, not defensively, rather thoughtfully. Clarissa took her coat from the chair. "I'm going now." She put it on. "Thank you for the tea." "Tea bag?" "Even so." A brief, genuine smile appeared on Melinda's face. They embraced. Briefly, but this time without the stiffness of the first embraces of the week, as though something that had been stuck fast for a long time had shifted by a millimetre. Not much, but perceptible. Clarissa went down the stairs. On the street she paused briefly and looked up. On the 3rd floor, light burned behind Melinda's window, a desk lamp, warm and still. She turned and walked out into the November evening. The next morning Clarissa left Fleming's at 7 o'clock. The bakery she passed opened at 7, a small, unassuming bakery in a side street, no more than 5 minutes from the hotel. The smell reached as far as the street. Butter, yeast, something sweet, just out of the oven. She bought 4 scones. The young woman behind the counter wrapped them in greaseproof paper and put them in a small brown paper bag. Butter as well, please. 2 small portions of butter wrapped in foil and a small pot of clotted cream. The woman packed everything carefully into the bag. Clarissa stepped out onto the street. The November morning was cold and misty. The streets were quiet. London was waking slowly as it always did, not all at once, but in layers. The bakers first, then the newsagents, then the first underground travellers with their coffees in paper cups. Eleanor lived in Clerkenwell. It was a quiet street of narrow terraced houses from the 19th century. Clarissa stopped before the house, 3rd bell from the top, E. Holt, in block capitals on a small white strip of paper. She looked at her watch. 7:30. Eleanor would still be at home. Ashford and Sons opened at 9, and the underground connection to Mayfair took 20 minutes. She rang the bell. Silence. Then, after a long pause, a sound from inside the house. Footsteps, slow, hesitant, as though someone were considering whether to open the door. The door opened. Eleanor Holt stood in the doorway. She wore a dark blue dressing gown, her hair open and dishevelled, her face without makeup. The pallor that Clarissa had noticed at their first meeting was now even more pronounced. She looked at Clarissa. Clarissa raised the brown paper bag slightly. "I've brought scones. I hope it isn't too early." Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it again. Something worked in her face, surprise, mistrust, exhaustion, and beneath it something else that Clarissa could not immediately name. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "What do you want?" "Just a little conversation over a comfortable breakfast." The flat was on the 2nd floor, small, but with high ceilings and 2 large windows looking onto the street. A stack of books lay on the coffee table. Eleanor led her to the kitchen. It was narrow and bright, with a small table at the window. Outside, one could see a strip of grey November sky and the rooftops of the houses opposite. "Tea?" asked Eleanor. Her voice was calm, but with an effort that Clarissa could hear. "Always." Eleanor filled the kettle. Her movements were careful, too careful, like someone concentrating so that their hands do not tremble. She set 2 cups on the table, took a teapot from the cupboard, an Assam, loose leaf. She measured it precisely. Clarissa sat down and placed the paper bag on the table. She opened it and set the scones, the butter, and the clotted cream in the middle of the table. Eleanor sat down opposite her. For a moment, they sat in silence. The kettle began to murmur. Outside, a delivery van drove slowly along the street. Clarissa looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the scones. Then she suddenly jumped up, put her hand to her mouth, and ran from the room. After a few minutes she returned, chalk white. She sat down at the table. "I was always sick in the mornings too," said Clarissa gently, "especially in the first few weeks." The silence that followed was entirely different from the one before. Eleanor raised her eyes. She was visibly trying to maintain composure, but she could feel her strength giving way. She had been holding back for too long. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I have suspected it since we were introduced," said Clarissa. "The flat shoes, the pallor, the slight swaying as you left the room." Eleanor nodded slowly, as though this were no surprise. as though she had known that someone would notice. The kettle switched off. Eleanor stood up, poured the water, left the tea to draw. Then she sat down again. "I would like to tell you something," said Clarissa. "A story." Eleanor looked at her. She said nothing, but she listened. "Once there was a woman," began Clarissa, "who was young and inexperienced and had come to London to find work. She had no qualifications and moved from one poorly paid job to the next. She was barely able to support herself. And then she met a man. He was considerably older, but experienced and charismatic. A successful businessman, wealthy and generous, he knew precisely how he appeared to people, and he knew how he appeared to her." Eleanor held her cup in both hands. She did not drink. "The woman became involved with him. It was not the great love, but she was very fond of him, and it seemed sensible to her. Her financial worries were a thing of the past. He paid for a comfortable flat in a good location and came and went as he pleased. She learned that he was married and had a family, but it did not trouble her, not at first." Clarissa spoke quietly, without haste. "And then she became pregnant, and he showed her who he really was." A very soft sound from Eleanor, not a word, only a breath that was slightly too abrupt. "He did not want the child. He told her so in no uncertain terms, and when she refused to do what he demanded of her, he threatened her and ended the relationship from one day to the next, as though she were a chapter he had turned over. Fortunately, the woman had by then already published a bestseller and was no longer financially dependent on him." Eleanor looked at the table. "The woman moved to another flat in another part of the city. She had the child a girl, and she never regretted having made that decision. Yet for years she felt pursued. She knew if she were ever to reveal the identity of the child's father, he would kill her, and the child most likely too. He was a man who kept his promises." Clarissa paused briefly. Eleanor was very pale. Her hands around the cup were motionless. Tears rose slowly in her eyes. "I understand how you feel, Eleanor," she said quietly. She stood up, took a few steps towards Eleanor, and placed her hand on her shoulder. Suddenly the woman jumped up. Clarissa immediately took her in her arms and held her. Eleanor began to sob, and Clarissa had to restrain herself greatly not to weep as well. She would never tell Melinda who her father was. After what felt like an eternity, they sat down again. "He wants me to kill the baby," said Eleanor in a breaking voice, "and for that I would dearly like to kill him. But I could never do that. I want him to understand at last, to understand me. I love him. I would never truly harm him. I wanted him to understand what it feels like to lose control in public before his audience." She paused. "I chose the dose very precisely. I researched carefully. I wanted to be absolutely certain. He was never in any real danger." Silence. Outside, a small ray of sunlight fought its way through the clouds, and the light in the kitchen grew brighter for a moment. "I was frightened," said Eleanor. Her voice was very quiet, almost without sound. "The whole time, while I was preparing it during the tasting and afterwards." She swallowed. "I have barely slept." "I believe you," said Clarissa. "From now on it will be better." "I only wanted to—" Eleanor broke off. She pressed her lips together. Then, after a moment, "I wanted to shake him awake." "I know. He didn't even." She swallowed again. "He simply ended it, and left money for the abortion on the table before he went. Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were wet and reddened. Clarissa poured tea, both cups. She pushed Eleanor's towards her. They drank. Outside the street grew livelier. Footsteps, a car door, somewhere the bright ringing of a bicycle bell. Then Clarissa said, very quietly, "You need not be afraid." Eleanor looked at her questioningly. "The police have nothing on you, and I will say nothing." Eleanor looked at her, doubtful, disbelieving. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely." Clarissa set down her cup. Tears rose in Eleanor's eyes again. "The child," she said, quietly, almost inaudibly. "Yes, I shall keep it whatever happens." "That is good," said Clarissa. She meant it, completely and without reservation. Clarissa stood up and put on her coat. Eleanor remained seated. "Eleanor," she said, "ring me if you need me, at any time." Eleanor looked at her. She attempted a smile. "Thank you," she said, quietly. Clarissa opened the front door and stepped onto the landing. Behind her, she heard Eleanor get up, the sound of a chair being pushed across the floor. Then silence. Clarissa left Fleming's shortly after 2. She had stowed a freshly brewed Darjeeling in her thermos and asked the porter to call her a taxi. University College Hospital was in Bloomsbury, no more than 20 minutes in normal traffic. Clarissa knew it slightly. She had been there once with Melinda many years ago. She remembered the long, bright corridors and the smell that was the same in every hospital. At the reception desk she asked for Sebastian Ford. The woman at the desk looked at her screen. "Room 214, second floor. Visiting hours begin at 2 o'clock, second floor." Sebastian Ford lay in a single room with a window looking onto a courtyard. He was dressed, not in a hospital gown, but in a blue pullover and trousers, as though he were about to leave. But he was lying on the bed, hands folded, staring at the ceiling when he heard her come in. He looked up. "Mrs. Hamilton?" He seemed surprised. "Mr. Ford." She drew the chair beside the bed closer and sat down. "How are you?" He made a gesture with his hand that lay somewhere between better and so-so. "The doctors say I can go home tomorrow." He regarded her for a moment. "You were at the tasting." "Yes." "I don't quite remember. I was nearby when it began." She left it at that. "I wanted to see how you were." He nodded slowly. He had been alone with his thoughts for days, which he was not accustomed to, and the company of another person was quite welcome. "Tea?" asked Clarissa. He looked at her. "In hospital?" She drew a small thermos from her bag. "I came prepared." A brief, genuine smile. The first she had seen from him that was not intended for an audience. "That is—" He shook his head slightly. "Yes, gladly. You haven't poisoned it, I hope?" Clarissa smiled. "Do you suspect me? What possible motive could I have?" "That was meant to be a joke," he said dryly. Clarissa had brought 2 small cups, collapsible, from the outdoor shop. She poured. A Darjeeling, first flush, which she still had from Fleming's. It smelled of muscatel and early spring, which in a London hospital room in November was almost absurd. Sebastian held the cup in both hands. He drank, was silent for a moment. "That is exceptionally good." "I know." They talked first about the tea-house, about Ashford and Sons, about the idea behind the tasting series. Sebastian spoke quietly, without the polished professionalism of his public appearances. Clarissa listened. After a while, Sebastian said, "I have been doing a great deal of thinking here." He looked out at the courtyard. Beyond the window, a bare tree, a bench on which nobody sat. One has time when one lies here. Too much time, perhaps. What have you been thinking? He was silent for a moment. How quickly everything can change. I might have died. Is that what you have been thinking about? Yes. He looked at his cup. About dying. And about living. Clarissa said nothing. She waited. I have been asking myself who would miss me, said Sebastian after a while quietly, and by that I do not mean my followers, I mean privately, and not much came to mind. That is sad, said Clarissa quietly. Yes. He looked at her. But it need not remain so. It was not a grand statement. He did not say it with emphasis or drama. He said it the way one speaks a decision one has reached alone, quietly, without an audience, without applause. Clarissa drank her tea. Outside a cloud passed, and for a moment light fell into the room, a narrow, bright strip across the floor. That is good, she said. Followers are no substitute for private relationships, for family, for love. Sebastian looked at her thoughtfully. Quite right, he said. Clarissa stood up. She screwed the thermos shut and tucked away the cups. I am very glad that you are feeling better, and that you have used your time in hospital to arrive at some important realizations, Mr. Ford. Sebastian, he said it without hesitation. Sebastian, she put on her coat, do get well soon, and be glad of your second chance at life. He looked at her and smiled conspiratorially. You may count on it, Mrs. Hamilton. Clarissa, she smiled too. Clarissa. He blew her a kiss. She went through the door and along the long, bright corridor, past the nurses' station, past the other rooms with their half-open doors, into the lift, and then into the entrance hall and out onto the street. London received her with cold air and the sound of the city. She stood for a moment and breathed deeply. Then she took out her phone and booked the train for tomorrow morning. 9:12, Paddington to Oxford. She had parked her car there. She put her phone away and walked back to the hotel. The train departed at 9:12. Clarissa was up at 7:30, had breakfast alone at Fleming's, toast, marmalade, an egg, and an Earl Grey Darjeeling, black, from her own tin, and then packed her suitcase in an unhurried manner. She did it methodically, as always, clothes first, then the books, then the tea tins, each one wrapped individually in a soft cloth, the thermos, freshly filled, on top. She looked around the room. Nothing forgotten. She went to the window. Half Moon Street, Mayfair. Below, a man walked with an umbrella, though it was not raining. A delivery van stopped briefly and drove on. London was grey and quiet. The porter called her a taxi. She drove through the morning traffic. Piccadilly, then Regent Street, then the long straight streets heading north. London slid past her, like a film she had seen many times. The facades, the people, the traffic lights, the small shops that changed with every decade, and yet always looked the same. Paddington Station received her with the smell of diesel and freshly baked croissants from the bakery by the entrance. The departures board clattered. Her train was already at platform 5. She bought a newspaper she would probably not read and went to the platform. The train was not full. She had a window seat. Naturally, she always booked a window seat and put her suitcase in the overhead rack and her bag on the seat beside her. She poured tea from the thermos. The Darjeeling was excellent and the world was in order. The train moved off. London slid slowly back. The The backyards, the graffiti on the walls, the gardens pressing up against the tracks, then the suburbs flattening out, then the first green. Clarissa looked out of the window and let her thoughts drift. She relaxed, with the tea in her hand and November England outside and the quiet rolling of the train beneath her. Eleanor, Sebastian, Melinda, Peter. The names came and went like the landscape outside. She had done what she could. The rest the people would have to manage themselves. In Oxford she collected her car. It stood in the car park at the station, a dark blue Volvo. The road to Rosewood led through fields and small villages, along hedgerows that were bare now, and past trees that had lost their last leaves. The sky was high and white. Clarissa drove slowly. She was in no hurry. Orchid Cottage stood there as though it had been waiting for her. That was, of course, nonsense. Houses did not wait. But it looked that way. The low facade, the small garden gate that hung slightly crooked, and which she had been meaning to have repaired since spring. The bare rose bushes against the house wall, and behind them, half hidden, the greenhouse, whose panes gleamed dully in the faint November light. She parked the car and sat for a moment. She was fond of this house. Then she took her bag and went inside. She hung up her coat, left the suitcase in the hallway, and went straight to the kitchen. Put water on, tea, then everything else. She chose the Kashmiri kawa, saffron, cardamom, almonds, the tea she kept for evenings, for moments of rest after something that had cost her strength. She waited until the water had reached the right temperature, poured, left it to draw. Then she went to the greenhouse. The orchids had done their best to manage without her. She misted them with water and submerged one or two in a water bath. A phalaenopsis had put out a new bud in her absence, a small, closed, firm bud, barely the size of a pea, on a stem that reached cautiously towards the light. Clarissa stopped. "Well done," she said quietly, and reached for a fertilizer stick. Later she drank the kawa at the small table by the kitchen window. Outside, the darkness came early, the grey deepening, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Rosewood. Silence. Orchid Cottage. She savoured every sip and looked out into the garden. 3 days later she was sitting in her study writing when the telephone rang. "Clarissa." Eleanor's voice at the other end of the line sounded excited. "Eleanor, how are you?" He rang. Clarissa put down her pen. "Last night," said Eleanor. "We talked for almost 2 hours. I don't know what will come of it, but we are talking again." "That is good," said Clarissa. "Yes." A pause. "I think it is good." They talked for a few more minutes about preparing the nursery, baby clothes, and the best toy shops. While they were still talking, Clarissa had got up and gone to the cupboard in the sitting room where she kept her photo albums. She looked out an album. It was pink and bore the title Melinda. She sat down on the sofa, opened it, and smiled.